Next up, Jon interviews Elisabeth Kendall about the role of poetry among militant jihadists in Yemen.
Elisabeth Kendall is Senior Research Fellow in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Pembroke College, University of Oxford. She works on connections between militant jihadi political movements and cultural production in Arabic, specifically in contemporary Egypt and Yemen. Elisabeth, welcome to Babel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You have morphed from a conventional academic scholar of poetry into somebody who reads more jihadi poetry than anybody I know. How did that happen?
Yes, I think that sums it up probably quite well, but it is a bit of a change. And my career change really happened around the time of the so-called Arab Spring, I guess, in 2010, when I was beginning to think that I'd like to be a bit more hands-on with all this years of training that I'd had in classical Arabic and poetry and literature to figure out a bit more about how it was being used on the ground. And I'd noticed, I was running a centre at the time, a UK government-sponsored centre that was researching jihad and martyrdom. I'd noticed that there was an awful lot of poetry produced by the different Mujahideen groups that wasn't really looked at all. So I took myself back into the field and started to try to find it.
Is any of it any good?
Well, it depends what you mean by good. It does the job, I think, of enticing recruits, of firing up the blood, of inciting outrage. It's very passionate. I don't think it's going to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, no.
You described your own background as having all this education and looking at a wide body of works. How does perhaps a semi-literate jihadi create poetry?
That's an excellent question because, of course, the poetry normally is in very classical Arabic, but there are a lot of tropes in the poetry, a lot of reused phrases, reworked images, stock expressions, which can be slotted in. And you have your bards of the movement. Not everyone is able to create this material, but you have your specialists. And of course, for the consumer, for the person who's listening, the audience, it doesn't actually matter if you understand every single word. You just need to be carried by the images that it creates.
How does one become a poet? Do you know?
No, actually, I don't know the answer to that. But I guess anyone can try their hand at it. There's no special rite of passage. Osama bin Laden wrote poetry, although I must say he didn't write as much as everyone thinks he did, because he was very adept at reworking the heritage. One's tempted to say plagiarizing it, but of course you can't really say that. It's more about just borrowing and enhancing and reworking than it is about plagiarizing. He wasn't shy of pinching verses from other poets. I think that the point to make here, though, is that poetry and being a poet is highly respected.
So it sounds almost like Latin in pre-Vatican II Catholic church services, that the people sort of heard the language, didn't necessarily understand what every word meant, but they had a general gist, but they loved the majesty and the imagery and the sort of sense and sounds of it.
I think there's a lot of power to that comparison that you've just made, yes. Although, of course, there's a bit of a sliding scale on this. Not all of it is highly classical. Some of it, most of it is, but some of it's also in shorter verses that are much more economical linguistically. They don't do all the verbal acrobatics that the more classical material does. And
a cappella, of course.
Islamic State is a bit fonder of those than Al-Qaeda.
What are the differences in the poetry between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State?
I have to be very generalist here. Actually, in the early days, Islamic State was producing a lot more poetry than it currently does. Got an interesting anecdote here. When I was riding in a tribal convoy through Yemen, and I wanted to see the effect of Islamic State poetry on tribal groups who perhaps more closely affiliated normally with Al-Qaeda. And I had one on my iPhone and just played it in the 4x4. And the guys have finally said, "Oh, Doctora, could you just stop? Could you just switch it off? This is really awful. If you want to have some good stuff, we'll get you some good stuff, but we don't like all this Daesh stuff." And they're much more partial to the, I mean, not that they're Mujahideen, I just want to stress that, but, they're much more partial to the Al-Qaeda style of poetry. But there were some very interesting early numbers that came out from Islamic State. They wrote poetry about the burning of the Jordanian pilot. They wrote an ode to the knife, which was published around the time of the Paris massacres. I mean, it was very violent and much less tuned in to the cultural heritage than what Al-Qaeda was and is producing.
I have heard that there's Houthi poetry for the Shia rebels in the north of the country who displaced what is known in Washington as the internationally recognized government. How does Houthi poetry compare to Al-Qaeda and ISIS poetry?
Well, I won't compare it, but I'd say the role is very similar. The Zawamil, the Houthi poetry, they produce masses of it, absolutely masses. And I've probably got a dozen Telegram feeds that pump this stuff out daily. And so, you often see it put to video recordings of Houthi military operations. It's extremely militant. It's quite catchy. And it plugs into this long tradition in the highlands of Zawamil poetry. So I think poetry and war, poetry and violence, poetry and pepping up a political cause go absolutely hand in hand.
How much of this is transnational and how much of this is unique to Yemen, where you've done much of your field work?
So that's difficult to answer, but it is a good question. I think that Yemen is particularly strong in the use of poetry as a cultural tool to get into hearts and minds. It's certainly not unique, but I think it has a stronger role there. When I surveyed local populations in the east of Yemen in 2012, 2013, and I slipped in a question about poetry, I was pretty amazed that 74% of respondents said that poetry played an important or very important role in their daily lives. That's daily lives. That's not weddings, funerals, whatever. This is every day. And so that was a pretty shocking result as far as I was concerned. But I asked a similar question in a survey I did with colleagues in Egypt the previous year, and it was a miserable 6% who thought that poetry was very important. Part of that might be explained because the respondents might not have understood a lot of what they're interacting with in Tahrir Square or during their revolution as poetry. They might have thought of it as song or just folklore, but in fact, it was poetry. So there might be an element of that. Nevertheless, I think it's true to say that in Yemen, the poetry does play a larger role than in some other Arab countries.
Does the fact that poetry is used in this way in these jihadi movements tell you something unique about these movements, or does it really tell you something about Yemen in particular and how Yemen operates?
I think it tells you both, John. I think it does tell you that these movements pay close attention to the need for emotional sustenance in a way that we in the West don't always recognize. In fact, I would say we very rarely recognize it. And that really misses the point about the sustainability of the movement. So much of it relies on keeping a steady stream of recruits and on keeping those who are already in the movement positive at a time when perhaps they're being decimated by drones, which certainly is happening in Yemen, or they're being pushed back by ground operations, as have been happening with Islamic State. This is a really, really key part of trying to keep your movement on track and keeping it lively and keeping it fed and fresh. So, I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a poem that really struck me that I just came across actually it was in a publication, and it was dedicated to 5 names. It was an incredible poem. It likened these 5 names who were all martyrs, freshly martyred, to the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, said that their act had been akin to the classical early Islamic battles of Uhud or the Battle of Badr. It was really very much hyping up these names. And when I researched it, it turned out these 5 guys were just teenagers who'd done nothing. They were rumbled in a safe house and shot dead in cold blood by the security services. But immortalizing them in that poem, making sure their memory lived on, was so important for fueling the movement, for making sure that people didn't get disheartened.
You talked about both reading poems and then getting recordings. I remember when Steve Caton wrote his book, The Peaks of Yemen I Summon, about Yemeni poetry several decades ago. He talked about cassette tapes. How much of this is performed live and how much of it is passed from hand to hand?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I would love to know the answer to that, but it's not data I can get my hands on because I can't attend the live performances. The interesting question, though, which you're bringing up, is of course the longevity, because the paper material can die out. We take the websites down, we remove their Facebook pages, we can close down their forums, but you cannot get rid of it from the collective memory. It just lives on.
Do you sense that this poetry will die out when conflict in Yemen diminishes, or is this going to be something that becomes a deep part of Yemen's collective literary history, that people remember the old poems of the years of strife?
I think it does. That the use of the poetry does change and evolve depending on the phase of the militant jihad movement. It will never die out. It will always be there, but it goes through peaks and troughs and changes the way in which it's consumed. Let me give you an example. Until the so-called Arab Spring broke in Yemen, it was about 2011 by the time it reached Yemen, there was a lot of written poetry in great big cultural periodicals that Al-Qaeda was producing. And then they died out. The political climate, the revolution, the uncertainty, the urgency meant that they switched into much more of a governance mode. Al-Qaeda switched into, right, we're going to try and start these little states, and we're going to put out news bulletins, which are much shorter, don't have space for all this cultural material. If the conflict in Yemen ends, it could actually lead to an even further blossoming of the poetry, because of course it's perfect for inciting locals who are disgruntled with the peace process, who feel it's left them out, who feel sidelined. This will inevitably happen, by the way, in any country that has a peace process. Final question.
What is the audience for these poems outside of jihadi groups? Does this have a broader non-participant audience of people who say, well, I just like the style, I like the imagery, but I don't like the movement behind it?
Yes, I think there is a broader audience for it. It, of course, depends on the poem and on how catchy it is, but particularly in Yemen, when the poetry is often sung, then yes, it's very catchy. And I'll give you one example. There's a really catchy poem that Al-Qaeda uses. This is in 2014, one of its many jailbreaks, and they sit together celebrating in a desert location, singing this poem. Ibn al-Khamish it goes on, and about 400 local people are just joining in, because what it means is Ibn al-Khamish, the head of the state security apparatus, has been vanquished. What's not to like? Everyone hates the state security. So, they can hit a nerve. And that's not saying that everyone who joins in with that chorus and attends is with the Mujahideen, but it helps win them toleration and a sort of sense of we understand what you're doing, although we wouldn't do it ourselves. I think it's very powerful in speaking beyond the movement. But to your final point, of course it's classical Arabic, so it can speak to, 23 at least Arabic-speaking countries, although the content can be quite local. What it doesn't really do is transfer to the kind of recruitment material that you need for Brussels, Paris, London, New York. That is a different style of material and is much more often nasheeds, so sung anthems, often with violent video background. It's a little bit different from the kind of poetry I'm talking about. What I'm talking about works really well in the field inside the Middle East to its primary Arabic-speaking audience.
Elisabeth Kendall, thank you very much for joining us on Babel. It's fascinating.
Thank you so much for your lovely questions.
You do really interesting and unique work, so I'm grateful.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much. Thanks for listening to Babel. If you liked what you heard here, please subscribe to our podcast at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. You can find more analysis about this topic linked in the show notes. And you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.